Thank you all so much for coming this morning to hear me talk. Thank you so much for SANS for having me, and I apologize if my voice is a little bit raspy. I've been at ShmooCon since Thursday, and if any of you have attended HackerCons, you know it's like your voice just disappears after a bit. So who am I? Why am I here? Why do you care what I have to say? My name is Whitney Merrill. I am a privacy attorney. I also do data security and incident response. I started my career unbeknownst to me when I attended DEF CON for the first time in law school and realized this is the community I want to be a part of. This is exactly what I wanted to didn't even realize what I was missing. So I went to law school at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, decided I didn't know enough about the field I wanted to advise, and so I stayed and got my master's in computer science with a focus in computer security and digital forensics right after school. After that, went to the Federal Trade Commission where I investigated companies for bad security and privacy practices, usually triggered by a data breach. And then ultimately left the government to go work in-house at a company. And there I do everything from incident response, data breach notification, to privacy engineering and supporting teams to answer any questions they may have lately about the GDPR. But one of the things that is going to be the theme in my presentation today is really how do you properly handle logging with this new realm of GDPR, because I'm sure many of you have heard. How many here have heard of GDPR? Yeah. I live and breathe it. I used to wake up at 3 in the morning for 6 months straight before GDPR went live, just in a panic that I would forget something. But today I'm going to kind of take you on the journey as the lumberjack. I joke with some of the teams that I will slice and dice what they're collecting. But I'll also kind of walk you through some of the situations that make me feel the tensions between privacy and security. So lawyers love disclaimers. I should make it very clear that I'm not your lawyer. This isn't legal advice. If you work at a company or individually, you should consult with your lawyer about how to handle things, but hopefully this will give you another perspective of kind of GDPR, privacy and security tensions. I'm also here in my personal capacity, so I don't speak for my employer. So let me give you some background. Generally, I'm going to tell a little bit of a story about the tensions between privacy and security. How many people here do privacy work? Okay, 3 people. I think that's really significant because most of the people, when you say, oh, I'm a privacy attorney, or oh, I do security, they assume that you also do the other. And so for me, I have found, especially in my current role, that those 2 things conflict with each other quite a bit. And how do we work through kind of the differences between the 2? So from the privacy standpoint, right, it's the right to have control over the information that you use. How is it when we collect information, do we protect it in a way that the consumer or the person you're collecting it about consents, believes that you're going to do something right with their data, that they are okay with what you're doing with their data? And security generally, and forgive me for watering this down a bit, is generally the protection of the data. What are the standards you're going to put around it? Where are you going to store it? How are you going to store it, et cetera? But security is necessary for privacy, but privacy isn't necessary for security. And so this is where the tensions really come about with privacy and security. When I talk to a security professional and I say to them, I'm really concerned about you collecting X, they're going, well, then we can't detect this threat, right? And so how do you work through what you should collect versus what the consumer or the business or GDPR generally allows you to collect? And so is it a full-on war? Somewhat, and in some cases, we're going to figure out what that balance is going to look like over the next 10 years as litigation comes about, as we really hopefully get more technical people in government and regulatory bodies to actually take a look at what the right balance is for these privacy and security tensions. And so in this talk, I'm going to talk primarily about can we have both and what does that look like. I'm going to try to strike a balance. And as Rick said, if you have feedback, so this is the first time I've given this particular talk, and I think it's really interesting, but I am really interested in hearing your feedback and your experiences in log retentions and what you need and feel like you need in your capacity. And the tensions of can we have both, it comes from a legal perspective that I'm going to come back to this slide a little bit later in the presentation, but what is reasonable security, right? That's the balance ultimately of privacy and data security. So, there we go. What's going on in Europe? Obviously, all of you almost have heard of the GDPR. One of the biggest articles that we really care about in GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Regulation, for those who are not familiar, but it sounds like many of you are. But reasonable security is incorporated into the GDPR in Article 32, right? They're saying that you have to take into account the costs of the implementation, the nature, the scope, the context, and the purposes in which you're processing, the risks of varying likelihood of severity of the rights and freedoms of natural persons, right? So what does that mean? And so I'm going to kind of break down in this presentation what that means from a very specific point of view. So reasonable security in the United States has been around for quite a bit. And I gave a talk a long time ago, or I guess about a year and a half ago, about what is reasonable from a legal perspective. Generally, it's almost the same as this, except for just kind of more wishy-washy, because lawyers love gray. And for how many people here regularly talk to an attorney or their in-house counsel? So a decent amount. How many people have heard it depends when you talk to a lawyer, right? The reason being is when we talk about legal standards, the law loves to create a standard that has enough flexibility that allows technology to change or the world to change, and then you apply that to the standard. So we don't really know if X is going to cause Y until the court basically rules on that. But in giving legal advice and legal guidance, we take a look at previous examples and we say, okay, how can we apply the facts? How can we advise on this situation based on what we know about that standard? So reasonable security in the United States looks at the foreseeable risk of harm of the actions versus the utility of the actions, the extent of the risk created, and the likelihood that that risk will cause harm to others. So that's kind of like GDPR. And any alternatives of lesser risk and the cost of those alternatives. So again, super wishy-washy, what does it mean? Under the GDPR, how many people here are familiar with PII or have been freaking out about PII under GDPR? GDPR vastly increased the definition, or broadened the definition of PII. Under the GDPR, it means any information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person. And so this can be identified, and I'm quoting this directly because it's important to know, directly or indirectly, in particular by reference to an identifier such as a name, an identification number, location data, an online identifier, or one or more factors specific to the physical, physiological, genetic, mental, economic, cultural, or social identity of that person. Oh, that's really big. So what does that ultimately mean? Well, IP addresses, device IDs, external-facing IDs. And what I mean here by external-facing IDs is if that user knows that that identifier is associated with them, it is now PII. Regardless of what it is attached to, that identifier is now PII. So that makes a lot of what you do and a lot of incident response, logging, et cetera, really difficult because there are loads of IP addresses everywhere in a company. But why do we care? The reason we care what is PII is under the GDPR, certain data subject rights were given to individuals, specifically the right to access the data you have about them. So if you're collecting IP addresses that are directly associated with that individual or device IDs, you need to be able to pull that data from your systems and provide that to the individual. They have a right to fix that data, which doesn't really come up much, but more is along the lines of Equifax and some of these other companies that are amassing giant, like, hordes of data about you. And then you go and look at your credit report and you realize they've looped in the other John Smith, and that John Smith doesn't pay his credit cards, and now your credit score is hurt. That's generally where this right of rectification comes in, but the right to delete your data. So if that ID or that IP address is associated with you, you have a right to have it deleted. So how do these tensions, right, work in with being able to actually secure your system, secure your company, or do your job with the right of the individual to have their data deleted? And so thankfully under the GDPR, they kind of thought about this a bit, and they said monitoring or alert purposes. Well, that's not like very, very helpful, because there are lots of other reasons why we collect data that might be useful to keep beyond what exactly the person who's collecting the data needs it for. So I also want to touch upon really briefly, and I'm not going to get into it too much, but there's this new law in California called the California Consumer Privacy Act. I'm only going to touch upon it to let you know that it exists and that it is going to affect businesses in California. It's kind of like GDPR light. So a lot of those rights that I mentioned before are also going to be a part of this. But it's giving the right for consumers to have a request a record of the data collected about them. It's going to give the right of erasure, so that right to be forgotten that you may have heard about. And so some of the companies that didn't have to deal with GDPR in the past are going to have to start worrying about it now. So now I'm going to get to the meat of the talk, right? What is really, really happening here? So why logs? Why do I care? Logs demonstrate a major tension between privacy and security. They're absolutely necessary for incident response, to run your company, to prevent fraud, but many create privacy issues, collecting too much information for too long. They violate the privacy's fundamental commitment to data minimization. And so as a security and privacy professional myself, I really do feel like I wear two hats. I'm that person screaming, where are the logs when an incident happens, because I need to figure out what the story is to tell a regulator. But I'm also that person working with teams to say, what data are you collecting? Where are you collecting it? Where are you storing it? And should you be keeping it? So in working through the past few years, I've kind of figured out some tips and tricks to actually finding a good balance. And so one of the big questions you should ask yourself is, why do you log? What's the purpose for which you're doing it? The number of teams or individuals I've spoken to about this topic who just, there were logs that they didn't know existed, or they're just collecting it because they think it's a good idea. We're all a little bit of data hoarders in our life. How many people here just, when they get a new computer, just port everything over? And I still have the papers I wrote in high school on this computer because it's documents. You just toss it over. We're all a little bit of data hoarders. So the other thing is you have a fear with data that you won't need it until you do. And so we easily forget about the data we're collecting, the data we're storing, and you may not need it until you look for it. And so because of that, you feel, sure, I'm going to collect this. If I need it, great, then at least I have it. But if I don't need it, it's not really doing any harm. And so that's where GDPR is kind of pushing back against those notions, right, of these data hoarding companies. And it's not that it's data collection is bad. It's that it's forcing companies to think about, and individuals to think about, why are they collecting it? Do they need it? And kind of pushing that data minimization principles. But the important thing is that logs tell a story, right? They help us look and figure out what is happening, what's going wrong. They help us build and improve systems. And so it's not that we don't want to have these, this ability to do this, right? That's why under the exceptions for GDPR, we have alert and monitoring. I think hopefully that gets expanded a little bit more as far to not just be for alert and monitoring, because we need it for some other good things, but what's important to realize too is that they're not always the same, right? Not all logs are equal. Some logs really provide vital information for the most important systems, and others just aren't needed, or they're collecting data that is really too much for the system that it's collecting. So these can be vastly cut down. And so I actually work with teams sometimes and actually say, pull a sample. Let's walk through everything that you're pulling and keeping. And let's make sure that we're not logging too much. But if you asked somebody what they could log, they would likely say everything. So I had a conversation with a security architect, and I said, you know, what would you design as your perfect system? And I'd say, log everything for a few years. And I was like, well, one, like, where would you store that? And how would you store it? Because that's going to get pretty voluminous. But he's thinking from the security perspective. If there's an incident, we're going to find it. We're going to be able to detect what happened. And then you have other teams where security goes and says, you know, do you log? And they're going, nope. And the system is holding social security numbers or really important PII. And you're going, you have no logs to who accessed the system? Like, and you want to scream internally. So the key here is to find a balance between the two. And so I'm going to go back and talk quickly about this exception, monitoring and alert purposes. It's not a magic exception, right? Everything could be for monitoring and alert purposes if we wanted it to be. But the reality is that's not what the GDPR is getting at the heart of, right? They want us to be able to do our jobs, but they don't want us to collect everything. So one of the important questions to start in evaluating should you be keeping this information, right, is what systems are logging. You should prioritize your systems. Figure out which ones have the most valuable information. So under the GDPR, there's this concept called data mapping. Has anyone here done anything involving data mapping? Aha, no one. So data mapping is a requirement under the GDPR, and what you have to do is you have to track and map where all PII is stored and processed across an organization. So that means you have to know where the flows of data are, what exactly the data is flowing between system to system. Does it have a security review? How long is it kept? What's the retention policy, et cetera? And so when you start mapping out an organization, you're asking questions like, what is stored in that system? What is collected by that system? What data flows through that system? And then you ask that follow-up question. Okay, now I know about the system. Is it logging? What other documents or systems are using the data that comes from that? So when you start figuring out what actually is being logged, you have a better view of, you know, what your situation is. And then you start to dig into it. Well, this is a really great opportunity. We're mapping our entire organization. You now know what systems are logging. You got to ask what's in them. What is it what we need? And you start digging into whether or not it's something valuable that you really, really need. Which goes to my next slide. Do you need it? Someone said, I put out on Twitter, you know, some good log puns and jokes because I thought, you know, add some humor to a 9 a.m. keynote. And someone said, you know, you can tell how old the log is by how many lines are in it, which it's great when you have really, really great, robust logs. But what I find is when I really go back and need them, it's taking longer times to parse through it, right? If we collect too much information and we don't really need it, when we go back to look at it, we're going to be inundated by too much data. So revisiting and looking at what you really need when you're collecting it is really valuable. And my favorite question is, can we just take the PII out of the logs? And this seems like kind of an obvious example, but can we truncate? Do we really need the full IP address? Are you using a user's email in that log? Are you using another identifier? Or can we maybe convert it to an internal identifier? Can we pull out the PII and make it so that the log is not collecting it? Can you hash any of the device IDs when you're storing it? What is the purpose of the log, right? If it's to understand that there's a unique event happening, do you need every little piece of information in it? And then this one, when I talk to folks, I say, well, you know, where are the logs made? Where are they stored? Where do you keep them? The big thing about it is sometimes you have logs that you have access to. Sometimes you have logs that third parties are collecting for you. But one of the most difficult things under GDPR is if you are using data, right, or data is being stored with a third party, you have to have a legal agreement called data protection agreement, or data processing agreement, sorry, commonly referred to as a DPA. So if you're storing PII on another third-party system, most likely, hopefully, you have an agreement with that system to store that PII. But I've run across instances in the past where you talk to individuals and they're throwing logs on some sort of system that isn't supposed to have them, or that's not the data, or that's not the system that you thought they were being stored on. And so this all goes towards that data mapping process, right? Figure out where your data is, figure out do you need it, figure out what the retention is. And so one of my favorite things and biggest headaches about the GDPR is that it forces you to look where your data is and really examine it. And ultimately, that's what breaks down here. So how long do you really need it? Personal data, right, if we don't have any PII in the logs, you can keep it for longer. You can keep those logs because you're not worrying about leakage or having to pull that data, having to delete that data. You can work out kind of what you're collecting specifically and generate a risk profile for each log and kind of figure out when and where you need to keep it. I tell teams that 29 is a magic number. Well, why is that? Well, under the GDPR, you have to delete data within 30 days. So if you're collecting data and you don't want to build out a system or process to go through and delete that data, 29 days it's going to auto-delete. So if the person stops using their system, after 29 days, you don't have to worry about running a deletion request or deletion generally on a system. I had another thought, and it lost it. So if I come back to this slide, you'll know why. But so who watches the loggers? You know, do you have policies implemented? Because not everything is created equal, right? If you're logging chat data or access logs, really it depends on the purpose of the logs. And this is really going to help when you're doing data mapping with your organization, is to help figure out what that right balance is. And so I said this before, but retention policies are a must. Don't keep everything forever. It's really not a good idea. We don't need stale data. But if you do need to keep data longer, can you pull out some of those elements of PII that might create a larger risk profile for that piece of data, right? If the IP addresses are going to be worthless in a while, or the device IDs are going to be worthless, but you want to keep everything else, can you strip that out and have basically two tiers, right? You collect a certain set of information, you keep that maybe for 6 months. After that, you want to use it for some other purposes, you strip out some of the data and you keep it longer. But figure out what your retention policy looks like, and that's going to really vary on the type of data obviously collected. And this is one of my favorite points. Is it really a log? This is one of the first things I ask teams or individuals when they talk to me about logging. Because did you build a service on top of it? If you did, it's no longer a log. I think people should stop thinking about systems that build on top of logs as actual logs, because if you do, the people advising or the way you approach it is going to be very different. One good example or as I like to say, one good example of this is that usually logs that have systems built on another build another log, right? You've built a system, and then now there's actually the log that the system is involved with or integrated with. And one of the best examples of this that I think is a GDPR situation is on Nintendo, users noticed that 1 year after they started playing a game, that the amount of time they played in a game reset to 0 at 1 year. And they were really angry because they wanted their playtime in a game. And I think that's very reasonable. I like to know that I've put in 42 hours into Breath of the Wild because I ran around a lot, and that's important to me. What I think happened here is no one said to whoever was working on the retention policies with this individual or team who worked on this, oh, we actually put that data user-facing, right? We actually care and build something on this. This is really valuable. This isn't just internal for us as a company to know how long people have been playing in a particular game. This is actually deleting. And I think this is an really good example of where someone thought this was just a log of playtime, and they thought year seems reasonable. But really, it was much more significant than that because there was a system built upon that to display it to the user. Breach, right? So we've talked about the privacy aspects, right? Cutting down the logs, thinking about data minimization principles, applying, caring about the GDPR. What about a breach? Well, like any incident response professional or threat intelligence professional, when you talk to the lawyers, they're often one of the first people to say, well, where are the logs? What do we have? What do we know about the incident? What should I care about? Do we know there's an intrusion? Do we know PII was exfiltrated? Do we know that PII was accessed? Right? We're really caring about this. And if you don't log, how would you know that the incident happened at all or that there was a problem? Because if you're not logging it, did the incident actually happen? And so the GDPR kind of touches upon this in their guidance. Basically, they say just because you have no evidence of an intrusion doesn't mean that that intrusion or that breach didn't happen. And so it's important to realize that proper logging is also required by the GDPR because you're supposed to be looking for detecting and worrying about intrusions. But also breach. And the reason I say breach ... not breach excited, is you may have seen this in the news relatively recently, so I guess it was May of last year, about 25 days before GDPR went live, where all of a sudden they found out that they were logging plaintext passwords. My guess is that GitHub was properly data mapping their organization, looking at their data minimization principles, looking at what data they're collecting, and that's how they stumbled upon this. So revisiting and looking at your logs are really important, but also your logs are a risk. And if you're not doing it properly, and you're not storing them correctly, and you're not treating them like the systems, right, that are generating them, you're gonna have an incident. And here's another one, Twitter, the exact same thing. And of course, right, they're saying, I believe both GitHub and Twitter, they didn't do forced resets of passwords, but what they did say is, we're gonna notify everyone and let them decide whether or not they want to reset their password. Primarily because they were saying they had no indication. And so I think about no indication means no logs. Or they weren't logging everything, right? You can't really tell, which is why I think they did notification, but didn't do the forced reset. It's a balance of the risk. But ultimately, when you're worrying, okay, the logs are breached, you have logs, access logs to the logs, it's just logs all the way down. And so this goes to whether or not you're building a system, right, on top of the logs that you're collecting. Because if you have built a system on access logs that either provide to the end user or provide to someone internally access profiles or information about whatever you can imagine. Are you logging the access to that, right? If you need PII, if you need really raw, valuable information, should you be going one more layer down and at least moving to the next step, which is kind of crazy, right? Because we can keep going, and where does it stop? And so the idea is back to, can we have both, right? It's a constant balance between privacy and security, figuring out what you really need versus what you absolutely don't need, and throwing that out. Because not all systems and data are the same, right? We shouldn't be storing email addresses and logs. Email addresses is very easy. If there is a breach of email addresses, you're going to have to do notification to regulators and likely to consumers under the GDPR. If you instead put in an internal identifier, that's much better, because that internal identifier, if leaked, right, we have less notification requirements, less cost, and less risk and worry, basically, to the individual whose data is contained within. And so, I said this before, but it's really, really important. Figure out which systems are important and prioritize, right? Everyone has the 2 or 3 places, right, or maybe 6 or 7 or 30, where the most important information is collected. Sorry, I need to. And so if you figure out which are important, then you can figure out what you need to prioritize and kind of move on from there. And sometimes the answer is going to be you need to log more. You need to put more data in. You need to have a longer retention policy because you're going to need to do that in order to see if there's an intrusion and kind of act accordingly. Because having really good data about the incident and what has happened is going to be key in explaining and telling the story to the regulator about what the risks might be to that individual. Because it's never fun to say to a regulator, well, we don't really know what happened. Like, could have been everything, right? Or, Equifax. Who knows to the extent to which they know all of that data was exfiltrated. But if you don't know, you have to assume the worst in some situations. So if you can log more and log better, then you can better tell a story to both, consumers, but also regulators. And good policies are important, right? It's important that you shape what you're collecting. And for everyone, this is going to be different. I wish I could come up here and say, if you're doing X, you should just keep it Y. But the reality is it's a very gray balance based on the data you're collecting and what you actually are using it for. And so I have about 15 minutes left for questions, because I wanted to make sure if anyone had any questions they could ask. But that's pretty much my presentation, and I thank you all again for coming.